Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into one of the most shocking and defining moments in Eastern European politics, Belarus breaking away from the Kremlin's grip. For decades, Belarus has been considered one of Russia's closest allies, almost functioning as a satellite state under Vladimir Putin's influence. But recent events are showing a massive shift that could reshape the geopolitical map of Europe. The long-standing bond between Moscow and Minsk is crumbling, and the reasons behind it go much deeper than anyone expected. For years, Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko relied heavily on Moscow for financial support, energy supplies, and political backing during times of crisis. When the Belarusian protests erupted in 2020, it was Putin who stepped in to prop up Lukashenko's weakened regime. The two leaders presented themselves as partners standing against the West's so-called interference. But beneath the surface, tensions were growing. Belarus's dependence on Russia came at a heavy price: loss of autonomy, economic vulnerability, and increasing public resentment toward Moscow's dominance. Now, that tension has reached a breaking point. Reports are emerging that Lukashenko's government is beginning to distance itself from Kremlin directives, particularly in foreign and defense policy. For the first time in decades, Belarusian officials are openly discussing the need for strategic balance, a diplomatic phrase that hints at an independent course, separate from Russian control. This shift didn't happen overnight. It's the result of months of quiet negotiations, political pressure, and behind-the-scenes maneuvering as Belarus tries to redefine its place. Between East and West, one of the clearest signs of this shift came with Belarus's unexpected decision to limit cooperation with Russia's military operations. Despite previously allowing Russian troops to use Belarusian territory during the Ukraine invasion, Lukashenko has now quietly restricted the Kremlin's access to certain bases and supply routes. Satellite data and intelligence leaks suggest that Belarus has pulled back from joint exercises and limited the deployment of Russian missile systems within its borders. This is a direct message to Moscow. Belarus no longer wants to be seen as a mere extension of Russian military strategy. But why now? Analysts say Lukashenko has realized that aligning too closely with Putin could drag Belarus into a conflict it cannot survive. The war in Ukraine has weakened Russia economically, politically, and militarily. Sanctions have cut Moscow off from global markets, and its allies are beginning to question whether Putin's vision of a unified Slavic state is collapsing. For Lukashenko, continuing to follow that path could mean isolation and eventual downfall. By slowly distancing Belarus from the Kremlin, he's trying to ensure his own survival and keep Belarus relevant in a changing world. Another factor driving this shift is the growing unrest within Belarus itself. Ordinary citizens are exhausted after years of repression, economic stagnation, and international isolation. Many Belarusians see Russia not as a protector, but as a force that keeps their country trapped in authoritarian dependency. Younger generations, in particular, are turning toward Europe, inspired by the democratic movements in neighboring Ukraine, Poland, and the Baltic states. This internal change in mindset is creating pressure on Lukashenko to adapt or risk being overthrown by a population hungry for independence and reform. Interestingly, this change is also being noticed in Minsk's foreign policy. Belarus has begun to restore limited diplomatic contact with European nations that once imposed sanctions against it. There have been quiet talks with Poland, Lithuania, and even the European Union about easing trade restrictions in exchange for gradual reforms. For the West, Belarus's potential shift away from Moscow presents both an opportunity and a challenge. If Belarus can be drawn closer to Europe, it could further isolate Russia. But it also requires careful handling to avoid provoking a full-scale backlash from the Kremlin. Moscow, of course, is not taking this lightly. Russian media has already begun criticizing Lukashenko, accusing him of betrayal and warning that Belarus's security depends on Russia. Kremlin insiders have hinted that Putin feels deeply betrayed by this turn of events. There are even rumors that Moscow might attempt to destabilize Belarus through covert operations or by supporting pro-Russian factions within its government. The tension between the two former allies is growing rapidly, and it's unclear how far Putin will go to maintain influence in Minsk. Economically, Belarus is walking a tightrope. For years, its economy was tied to Russian oil and gas subsidies. But as Russia faces financial strain, those subsidies are disappearing. Belarus is being forced to look elsewhere, exploring trade deals with China, Turkey, and even some European markets. This diversification is another indicator of independence, signaling that Minsk no longer wants to be held hostage by Moscow's economic leverage. Still, this transition won't be easy. Cutting ties with Russia means losing billions in annual support, and Belarus's industries may struggle to adapt to new markets and regulations. What makes this moment truly historic is that it reflects a larger pattern emerging across Eastern Europe. Countries that once stayed quiet under Russian pressure are now asserting themselves. From Moldova to Kazakhstan, former allies are stepping back and reevaluating their relationships with Moscow. The war in Ukraine exposed the weakness of the Kremlin's regional dominance, and Belarus breaking away could accelerate that decline. It's not just a political shift. It's the unraveling of an entire post-Soviet system that Putin spent 2 decades building. Lukashenko's motives may not be purely democratic or reformist. This move is likely driven by survival and pragmatism rather than ideology. But regardless of his intentions, the outcome could permanently alter Belarus's trajectory. For the first time, the country is beginning to explore what true independence might look like. Whether this transformation succeeds will depend on how Belarus navigates its next steps, balancing between Russia's anger, Western skepticism, and the demands of its own people. The next few months will be critical. If Belarus continues to assert its autonomy, we might see a series of retaliatory moves from Moscow, economic sanctions, political pressure, or even attempts at regime change. But if Lukashenko can stabilize his country while keeping communication open with both East and West, Belarus could emerge as one of the most strategically important states in the region. In the end, this massive shift isn't just about one country changing direction. It's about the balance of power in Europe shifting before our eyes. The Kremlin's control over its neighbors is weakening, and Belarus might be the domino that sets off a larger chain reaction across the post-Soviet world. The world is watching closely as this quiet revolution unfolds, because what happens next in Minsk could shape the future of Eastern Europe for decades to come. This is not just a political realignment. It's a historical turning point. The once loyal ally of Russia now stands at a crossroads, choosing between subservience and sovereignty. Belarus's bold move marks the beginning of a new chapter in European history, one that will test the limits of Russian influence, the resolve of Western diplomacy, and the will of a nation that is finally ready to stand on its own.